Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reading Culture, and welcome to what will really be our first literary exploration. Now, it's not going to be perhaps the text that you would expect to start with. We're going to begin with Plato's Allegory of the Cave from his Republic. Now, in many ways, Plato is a very great place to start because he is one of the foundations of Western literature. But he is, of course, a philosopher. Right? 400s before Christ, the student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, right? One of the kind of foundational figures in Western thought, but nevertheless a figure of philosophy. So why, if we're thinking about reading culture, if we're thinking about literature, why start with him? Well, I hope to make that clear in a moment, but first I just want to contextualize a little bit what we're going to be looking at. So the text that we're looking at today, as I mentioned, is the Allegory of the Cave. Now, it's part of a larger work now generally known as the Republic, which deals with politics to a degree, but perhaps at a higher, more abstract level. It's talking about issues of justice, issues of morality, issues of philosophy. But it does have some bearing on how we consider concepts more broadly. So in this course, the first thing we're going to be looking at with regards to cultural manifestation is heroism, the concept of the hero. Well, before we get into the specifics of that, I really would like to think about how we deal with concepts, right? The heroism is an abstract concept. We're going to be looking at it within the context of literature. How do we think about concepts like this in the literary realm and possibly beyond that? And it is for that purpose that we're going to be looking at the Allegory of the Cave. So the Allegory of the Cave is, of course, an allegory which appears in a section of the Republic. Now, the Republic, like most of Plato's work, is a dialogue, right? It's a dialogue between characters. So the basics of the allegory are that Socrates, right, the teacher of Plato, who is a character in the dialogue, in Plato's dialogue, is speaking to a character called Glaucon. And he's trying to explain a concept to him, which he feels is best described using allegory. And so he uses the allegory of the cave. And this is the basics of the story. Imagine people who have spent their entire life in a cave, chained up so that they can only stare at a wall, right? That's all they can see. There's a flame, there's some kind of light source behind them, and people passing by and the images of things and animals. And this is casting, projecting shadows upon the wall. Now, these shadows on the wall are all that these people have ever seen from birth. Therefore, they believe that these shadows are reality, right? That they're real, and that indeed any of the voices or the sounds that they hear are coming from the shadows, that it's reality. That's all that they can see. But imagine, after having spent their entire life in this way, that they get out, or at least one person gets out, escapes. And he sees, what does he see? Well, he sees the flame that was casting the shadows. Right? He sees the objects, right? The effigies that were the source of the light projecting on the wall. Now he sees all these things. He can reject them. They can go back to the shadows. He can reject the shadows and embrace them as reality. But he can also go further. What? This is all in a cave. Remember, what if he's taken and dragged out, forced to ascend out of the cave, out into the world? Right? Would he not be blinded by everything he saw? Would he not possibly, out of pain, reject it and go back into the cave? Maybe at first he could only see things via reflections, like the reflections on the wall. Maybe he could only see things by looking in the water and seeing the reflections in the water. Eventually he could see things kind of in a haze before he could perceive objects. And then he could look up. He could look at the moon and the stars, right? And going ever greater levels of light, intensity, until finally he is able to see the sun. Now he could reject all this again and go back. Or he could go back down into the cave and tell everyone what he has seen and try and bring them up, force them to ascend from the cave. Would they believe him? Would they not reject this as a wild fantasy? Would they not instead accept the effigies, or accept even the shadows on the wall as reality, and put this perceived madman to death? Now, this allegory, this story that Plato tells in the Allegory of the Cave, may seem very abstract. And on first glance, it may not be clear how this is relevant. What is he talking about? Why are we beginning with this? Well, perhaps the best way to really pull this story apart. I wanted to tell it to you here at the beginning, just so you really got a sense of the narrative force of the thing. But let's actually read through it together. So if we look at the text itself, right, again, we're at the very beginning of, right, we're in this dialogue, so you'll see multiple characters here, right? It's Socrates, it's Glaucon speaking, and they are engaged again in a larger philosophical discussion, but Socrates is using this allegory to try and speak to him. So he tells him here, right at the very beginning, "Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den." Right, so light can penetrate the cave. It's not totally dark. Here they have been from childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads, right? So their eyes are fixed forward. Again, it's kind of a cruel image, but think about it symbolically. Above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is raised a way. And you will see, if you look, right, try and imagine this picture in your minds, right? A low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. So if you've ever seen a puppet show, right, you can imagine something like that. Only, right, the images are being created by objects other than marionettes, right, by people. This is a very important image because, again, if you think about what literature is, we're not going to be looking at film in this series of lectures, but we are going to be looking at, nevertheless, representations of reality. In some cases, we're going to be looking at plays, which involves physical representation, but even when it doesn't, even literature itself is a kind of marionette show, in a way, right? It's the acting out of actions by created things. Now, they're created characters that may not have physical instantiation in the same way that we might think about, a film or a play, but doing a very similar kind of work. All right, so this is the opening image, and Socrates continues here. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels, and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall, right? So again, these are all the kinds of objects which can be represented, if you think about it, in all kinds of forms, literature, drama included. Some of them are talking, others silent, right? So some of these things speak, some of these things are just mute objects that they can see the images of. Glaucon responds, "You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners." And again, this is a very strange allegory that he's telling. But then he says this, which is really interesting, because again, it is so strange. He says, "Like ourselves," I replied. In other words, he's saying, these people that are chained up are like ourselves, are no different from us. Well, first and foremost, obviously, this is signaling the allegorical nature. So an allegory, of course, is a story or an image which uses symbols which represent something else. Right. So in this case, right, the shadows represent something other than the shadows. The people chained represent something other than those who are chained. The cave represents something else. The sun, everything has some kind of, now it may not always be clear what that is, and we'll try and maybe work through it. And it may also be applicable in different situations. So within the context of reading culture, maybe we will read this a little bit differently than if we were simply Platonic philosophers. But the main thing to take away here is that although we may not literally, of course, on a material level, be like them, we aren't living chained up in a cave, we are, according to Plato, at least like them symbolically. Now, to that idea, it's worth thinking about all the things that are being described in the cave, right? We have the shadows on the wall. We have the artifacts in the cave, right? These things that are carried back and forth and cast the shadows. We have the reflections outside the cave, right? Once he gets out, he's going to see the reflections of things in the water, and then we have the real things outside the cave, right? Objects, the moon, the stars, the sun. And we can possibly think about these as representative of stages of mental development, right? However, the separation of the stages is not always clear. So are there 4 stages? Are there 5, for instance? We don't really need to worry about that here. We're not even concerned about some of the intricacies of the philosophy. We really are interested not in precision, but in really grasping what Plato is trying to illustrate in a very broad sense, so that we can consider it when we start looking at specific instances of literary creation. Okay. So he says they're like ourselves, and they only see their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. Right, so they can only see the shadows of people, right? They can't actually see themselves. But remember, these shadows are cast by things. So there's a question when we're considering what Plato is trying to illustrate with his allegory of how real are the things that are doing the casting, right? They seem within the allegory like real people, unlike perhaps the shadows, but are they as real as the things that are outside the cave? Well, we'll look at that in a moment, but keep that in mind. For instance, the difference between the sun and the fire. They're both sources of light, but of a different degree. And also keep this image in mind when we think about literary creation as a reflection of reality, right? In what sense is literature real, and what is its relationship to what we consider as reality? In other words, if culture is both made up of what people do in reality, but is also made up of what they create in terms of art and literature, what is the reflection of that? Or a character, for instance, right? How is a character in a literary work a reflection? Or the experience even of an individual, perhaps a real individual or even a literary individual creation, how that can reflect a larger reality. After all, we're talking here, or will be talking about the concept of the hero and heroism, which is a larger reality. We're not just talking about a series of individual heroes here. So the experience of an action, for instance, may be described as moral or laudable in a heroic sense, right? But that's an instantiation of an ideal of heroism that exists outside both that individual character and also outside that individual so-called heroic action, right? That's kind of the idea that the heroic action itself is the shadow on the wall, perhaps. And one's thoughts about that, the moral of the heroic action, as one sees it, that's really the effigy casting the shadow. So for poetry, Plato sees poetry as potentially that which binds, fetters the prisoner and determines with what shadows they see. So in other words, the kind of literature you read, the kind that you're exposed to, will form your culture and thus will form your conception of, well, many things. In this case, say, heroism. It'll form where your head is turned. So the kind of shadows you see, right, that's coming from the kind of examples of heroism to which you were exposed. So that would be the Platonic view anyway. All right. So, true, he said, how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads, right? This is Glaucon speaking. In other words, he's agreeing with this because after all, how could they see anything else? Their heads are fixed. And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. Yes, he said. Right? So in other words, they can't see each other. They can't even see the objects. They can only see the shadows of all of this. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? In other words, they may not be able to see each other because they've been chained all their life looking forward, but they can hear. So they can hear one another and speak with one another. But because they've never seen one another, perhaps they would actually assume that these things before them are what are being named. Now, this is a bit of a difficult concept to get into, and again, this isn't a really, truly philosophy discussion. We're only using this as a basis to talk about literature, so we don't need to get into it too much. But consider this just briefly, that for Plato, here we have an important distinction. Platonically, words refer to types, as they refer to, we could maybe say, ideals or forms, things outside of an object. In other words, within the allegory, things that exist outside the cave. They don't refer to the shadows themselves. That's the mistake that these people chained up since childhood make, that they believe that the words refer to the shadows themselves. So in other words, and to use an example pertinent to our own purposes here, when we use words like hero or heroism, according to Plato, we would not be referring to a heroic character or an action, properly speaking, but to the type of the hero. Now, insofar as it has been substantiated, given, you can almost say, form by uh, a particular literary character. However, this distinction is important to a degree, as I mentioned, because if we simply say that, well, a hero is the specific character, but that has no relation to, right, another character in a different literary work that we are also describing as heroic, then we can't really have a larger discussion. In other words, we can't even have uh, a broad categorization of texts under the umbrella of heroism. But if we understand that the word refers to something outside of the individual work or the individual character, and we're talking about heroism in a kind of as an ideal, or again, the idea of heroism, the form of heroism, the form of the hero, then we can have a broader discussion. So it's a potentially helpful concept, right? As long as we don't get too bogged down in the kind of technicality of it, which we don't need to here. All right, so he goes on. True, he said, how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Right? Again, their heads are fixed. They can only see the shadows. And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. As he said, and they would only be able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? Okay, we already went over this. Very true. And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side. Would they not be sure to fancy, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice which they heard came from the passing shadow? So in other words, the idea is that there are real people passing around behind them, speaking, and their words, right, their utterances are echoing off the wall, the same wall upon which the shadows are being cast. Therefore, he's conjecturing, possibly causing them, since all their life, all they've been able to see fixed forward are these shadows, right, causing them to think that maybe the shadows themselves are the source of these sounds. No question, he replied. To them, I said, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. That is certain. So in other words, for these people, the shadows on the wall, they are their reality. They are the only true thing in their experience. Right? In a sense, literally that would be true for them. Even to the point that things which don't emanate from them, the voices of other people, again, are seen by them, or conceived of by them as the true source, the shadow. So again, one can imagine that if you don't have a conception that there's a larger idea of heroism out there, you might simply ascribe to anything you read or see that that is the emanation of that. Well, right, that superhero is heroic because, well, he's a superhero in a superhero film, say, without thinking that, well, perhaps there's something behind that. Perhaps there's a larger ideal. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. All right, so now we get this idea of what's going to happen if they're released. Now, again, allegorically, what does this process of release represent? Well, for Plato, it seems that one can easily imagine that this process happens through education. In other words, it's really ignorance which keeps one locked into place and looking at the wall, and education frees one from these fetters. And I would really keep this in mind when we look at a text we're going to be studying in a couple weeks called Faluti's Convocation Address. It's a convocation address that talks about really a kind of university of sorts that's set up in a concentration camp in communist Hungary in the 50s. And think about what education does there. I think that'll be useful to maybe take this abstract concept and give it a specific again, substantiation. But we can leave that aside for now, but keep it in mind. So at first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. Right, which makes sense. Again, if these people from childhood have only ever seen shadows, they haven't ever seen the light that was causing the shadows to be cast, right? It would be painful, right, to see that. But again, just note here that the firelight is not the sun. We're going to get to that later. And so it's possible that for Plato, the firelight may only represent convention, for instance. So again, for the purposes of our discussion, it could represent a kind of moral or heroic convention, possibly. We talked in the previous video about what heroism is, all the various things that heroism has meant, right? It's been a kind of mythological, demigod, right? It's been a noble martial character. It's been anyone who does a noble or admirable actions. And it's been the protagonist that we identify with. It's all these things. These are all conventions. So we could imagine that as possibly being something like the firelight. Then there's a question of how you react to this. So these conventions or these effigies, right, the things which cast the shadows, they can either be clung to erroneously. In other words, you can be unwilling to give them up and say, no, this is the convention with which I am familiar and I don't want to give it up. Or you can flee from it. So it's important to note that being a convention does not necessarily indicate falsehood. In other words, just because a certain kind of heroic representation is a convention does not mean that there's nothing true there. So again, this could manifest itself as refusing either to consider conceptions of the heroic that are foreign to one. So in other words, we're going to be looking at, in the coming months, a lot of historical texts. And some of these texts are going to have conceptions of the heroic which are very, very foreign. Indeed, in fact, the first thing we're going to be looking at are some myths from the Mi'kmaq people of Eastern Canada. And they're going to be, in many ways, very, very different from a modern kind of Western conception of the heroic. And so we can simply refuse to even consider that at all, right? And only cling to what, as 21st century people we're familiar with. The other possible reaction, though, could be to say, upon perhaps realizing that one's conceptions of the hero and of the heroic are indeed based in some kind of convention, to simply say that, well, they're all false and I should give them up entirely. And that also is the other kind of extreme. And I think possibly what looking at Plato's allegory of the cave can do for us is help us navigate how to potentially avoid being either one, locked into a conception of the hero which is very rigid and based in only our own experience thus far, or two, automatically assuming that identifying something as conventional means that it has nothing important or truthful to tell us at all. So I think this is kind of an important part of the allegory. All right, so right, they're turning towards the light. He will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which, in his former state, he had seen the shadows. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being, and his eye is turned towards more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? Truer, he says. So in other words, the idea is that if they've only seen shadows their entire life, so say there's a cup which has been passed by, and he's seen the shadow of that cup his entire life, and he believes that the shadow of the cup is the real thing. That's his only experience. When he sees the real cup and it's pointed out to him to name it, will he not perhaps say that the shadow of the cup is more real? Possibly. Isn't it conceivable, for instance, that if you've only ever thought about the shadows of things, that that again the a specific substantive example of a hero will seem more real than your ideas about the hero, possibly? All right, we're thinking about continuing on. And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away to take refuge in the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? True, he said. This is a really helpful image, because one of the advantages of allegory is that even though in this case it's very strange, right? It's very much beyond any kind of experience we have. It nevertheless uses very tangible images within it that we can very easily identify with. So we probably all have the experience of, especially coming out of a dark place and looking at a light, and right, and you have to turn away, right? It hurts your eyes. You have to avert your eyes to avoid the pain. And also how it may be difficult to see in the light initially. Coming out of the darkness, it may actually be easier to see by turning away. Right? There's a very tangible image, so that even if we're having difficulty grasping what is it that Plato is trying to say here, that maybe if we think about that it can be a little bit easier. And again, if we're not used to thinking about ideas, if we're only used to thinking about, say, plot, right? The hero does this and then he does this, that it can be kind of hard to turn away. Like, what are you talking about when you're talking about this idea of the hero? That's, somehow, right? Only what the hero is doing in the story is a reflection, right? It can kind of be even kind of almost mentally painful, right? It's not worth looking at. If we adjust our eyes, though, it can be then a lot easier to actually adjust and start thinking about ideas, and so that we're not simply falling into, say, plot description, but are looking at kind of higher concepts in terms of what is happening in the literature itself. All right. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent, and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. Note that he kind of personifies the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. Not all in a moment, he said. So again, a similar image, only now with a greater light. And again, a very tangible image that we can probably all identify with, of being blinded by the sun. Even when you're not looking at it, which you shouldn't do, of course. The idea of an incredibly sunny day, if you just come out of a very dark place, right, you have to avert your eyes, and things aren't clear, and that's very interesting. Of course, light is always a symbol of knowledge. Why? Because we can see in it. You can't see in the dark. Therefore, you can't know what's out there, right? Hence, it's a symbol of ignorance. You can see in the light. You can see via the means of the sun. Hence, it's always a symbol of knowledge. However, if you've come out of darkness, come out of ignorance, then going into the light, you may not be able to see everything, even though it is the means by which you see, but because you are not adjusted to it. So in other words, again, if you're not used to thinking about ideas, if you've never thought about the abstract form of concepts, of heroism, of the hero in this particular instance, or even of culture, say, or of literature in more broad terms, right, you might not be able to see it. It might not be clear. But once you've adjusted to the light, then you will be able to see a lot more. That's the idea that Plato is working with here. Right. So he will require grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of men and other objects in the water. Right. So in other words, we have the return of shadows, but now it's the shadows cast by the sun, not by the fire. And you also have the reflection of water. So again, it's a reflection, a kind of return to convention, um, uh, in the sense that it's a reflection, but it's obviously closer. And not only that, but even this reflection, while still technically a reflection, because it's in the water, it's in the light of the sun, right? It means that returning to the kind of convention of the cave, the shadows, is now more difficult. How can you go back now? All right. Uh, so, first you will see shadows best, next the reflection of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves, right? He'll be able to actually look at, I don't know, trees or something like that. And then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven. And he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light by day. Certainly, right? So again, turning to higher forms of, so first these are all things, right? Past reflection. So first the shadows, reflection, then to the actual objects, and then to the actual sources of the light. So to the ones which are less bright initially, light of the moon and the stars, right? And you'll actually do this, it's actually easier in the night, which is interesting because they're lesser forms of light. And then last of all, he will be able to see the sun. And not mere reflections of him in the water, right? That's where he starts, right? Reflections of the sun in the water, but he will see him in his own proper place and not in another. And he will contemplate him as he is, certainly. Obviously, we don't need to think about the kind of material considerations of not looking at the sun here, right? Again, this is an allegory. For Plato, the sun is an allegory for goodness, the good. However, we need not be abashed to also see it as truth. In other words, if we are having a consideration of the hero and heroism, we aren't going to get very far if we only stay at the level of the shadows, right? Of again, individual plot action of invented characters. And if we approach it and say there's no such thing at all as the hero or heroism, then we certainly can't have any kind of meaningful discussion about it. But if we accept that there's some kind of idea out there that tells us something about what is good or something that is true about the idea of the hero, then if we can actually look at that and see that and grasp that, it will illuminate everything else, including all of the specific works that we will be looking at as we go on. All right, so he will then proceed to argue that this is he who gives the seasons and the years and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, in a certain way the cause of all things which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. Clearly, he said, he would first see the sun and then reason about him, right? In other words, you first see the form of the thing for which you were looking at, and then you start reasoning, what is this thing? What is heroism? And when he remembered his old habitation, that is the cave, and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, discussing these shadows on the wall, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them? Certainly he would. In other words, do you not think that he would find that it was a felicitous, it was a happy thing, right? That he had escaped from that world of shadows and had ascended out into the sun, and that he would pity those who were stuck there. One can easily imagine that. And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before, and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, better to be the poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything, rather than think as they do, and live after their manner? Right, which that's from Homer's poem The Odyssey, book 11, line 489. In other words, imagine, and it's interesting that he brings in Homer here, because let's think about literature within the context of what Plato was talking about. Right? Imagine that you had people who had prizes based on simply knowing, right, the shadows. In other words, say plot elements of fictitious creations, right? If people only know the basic elements of literary works, but haven't actually thought about anything higher than that, right? Is that not a kind of shallow reward to the person who's actually plumbed into the depths of the thing and sees what's actually behind it all? In other words, right? Imagine that uh, one of our upcoming texts, right? You are able to have a discussion with someone about everything that happens in it. Right? The hero does this, and then he defeats this obstacle, and what have you. But now imagine instead that you've thought about the nature of that character's heroism, right? What it's based in, right? The moral choices that the character makes, his weaknesses, his strengths. Would that not be a much more fulfilling conversation, perhaps, than simply a kind of A, B, C sequence of here are the things that happen? That's one way we could possibly apply what Plato was saying here, but let's continue on. Yes, he said, I think that he would rather suffer anything than entertain those false notions and live in this miserable manner. Right? Again, one can easily imagine that. Why would anyone go back to having their head chained at a wall looking at the shadows if they had gotten out of the cave? Imagine once more, I said, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? To be sure, he said. Again, another easily understandable image. As we all know, if you come out of an incredibly bright situation into an incredibly dark place, you will be blind. Your eyes will eventually, again, if you're used to the dark, accustom themselves and you can see. But if you're coming out of the light, you will be in darkness. And if there were a contest and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable. Would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that he went up and down, he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. And if any one tried to loose another and led him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. In other words, coming back down into the cave, you wouldn't be able to see. You couldn't even properly see the shadows. And this would be seen as detrimental. In other words, we don't want people going up to the light. It blinds them. In other words, once you start looking at higher concepts, then all of a sudden, the kind of minutiae, these shadows on the wall, you don't see them in the same kind of way anymore because they aren't your focus, right? Your eyes have kind of seen something else that's affecting their ability to see. And so again, within the allegory, the idea is that they wouldn't want anyone else going outside of the cave, and he makes quite a radical statement, which said, right, they would even put them to death. But this is exactly what happened, you see. So Plato's teacher, as I mentioned at the beginning, was Socrates. Now Socrates, right, really the foundation on which all Western philosophy is built, right, went around teaching philosophy, right, using dialectic, a kind of dialogue, right, where you search out the truth. And he so disturbed the people of Athens that they condemned him, right? He was put on trial, as you can read in Plato's Apology, and he was accused of not believing in the gods. He was also accused of corrupting the youth with his philosophy, and he was ultimately condemned to death. And Socrates ended up consuming hemlock, right, a kind of poison, right, and committing suicide rather than be executed. So this isn't an abstract thing for Plato, right? He saw his teacher trying to lead people using philosophy out of ignorance, and ultimately saw him condemned to death. Now, hopefully, we won't, in talking about literature and culture, be doing anything that people want to execute us for. But again, it will be worth thinking about in a couple of weeks when we get to Faluti's convocation address. Some other texts as well, but it'll be most evident there, where we see this real battle for life and death in a communist concentration camp. right, we'll see how important the education and knowledge and thinking about higher ideals will actually be in context. But it's quite a dramatic thing that Plato is saying here, and Glaucon agrees, no question. All right, so let's look at this last paragraph. So this entire allegory, I said, you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun. And you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed. Whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all. It is seen only with an effort, and when seen, is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. So he really sums everything up, right? In many ways, in language that we've already been using, right? This idea that the prison house of this cave, right? That's the world of what we can see, right? The light of the fire, the sun, and this whole thing of ascending out of the cave is ascending into the intellectual world, right? In a lot of ways, this is really the best allegory for what it is like to try and live the intellectual life, right, and actually think about higher ideas rather than just the kind of day-to-day material existence, which is necessary when discussing literature, because literature requires some kind of engagement in the intellectual life. And we also see Plato's opinion that this idea of knowledge and of goodness is the kind of the last thing at which you get to. And indeed, if at the end of this exploration of the hero and heroism in literature, if it ends with some kind of conception for any of you that this is the kind of the best and the most good concept of the hero, it will almost assuredly only come at the very end, because we have to go on a very long journey just to get an idea of what heroism maybe is and how culture affects it, right? And again, it takes effort, right? And the idea is that we have to think about certain universal ideas of heroism. That's why we're looking at things from different cultures and all kinds of different time periods. And it will take a long process of reasoning to kind of think about what truth, if any, is there in these various conceptions of the hero. What do they say about reality that is actually worthwhile? That you have to kind of have your eyes fixed on some kind of idea, and that's why I want to start with this this allegory, to think about if our idea of reading culture is that we can see something, we can say something about culture by reading those things which it produces, in other words, its literary products, then we have to assume that there is some kind of connection, again, between the real world in which we operate and the world of literary production, even though, of course, it is fictional, although we will be looking at some nonfiction as well. And a potential trap that one could be tempted to fall into is that of plot description. So, in other words, we're going to be looking at some very traditional conceptions of the hero, Beowulf and King Arthur. It could be tempting to fall into a kind of Shadowland, whereby you simply describe a series of plot actions. In other words, well, Beowulf is a hero because he kills the dragon. And then you can go on to describe how he goes about doing that. Or perhaps, conversely, you could think, well, there doesn't appear here to me to be anything that falls into plot. Again, like I mentioned earlier, one of the first things we're going to be looking at is some myths of the Mi'kmaq people, and they will be very strange to us if we are not from that culture. And so we could simply say on a plot level, I don't see here anything that seems particularly heroic to me, and simply disregard it, right? But we want to move out of these Shadowlands, right? The world of plot description, of plot summary, and get to higher ideas. So if we move to that next level, to those things which are casting the shadows, those objects, those effigies, right? These are we could see, using Plato, possibly analogous to the cultural conventions of heroism that are based in literature. So we're going to have the cultural conventions of the Mi'kmaq people, but eventually we're going to have the cultural conventions of, more modern Western people, of the medievals, of people from the Renaissance, right? We're going to have all kinds of various cultural conventions. But again, we don't want to be tricked at stopping there either, and simply, like I mentioned before, either not wanting to move outside and considering, well, maybe some of these ancient oral tales of the Mi'kmaq, maybe they don't correspond with the kinds of heroic conventions that I have, but it doesn't mean I have to reject them, right? I can still see something in them possibly that reflects this idea that we're talking about, this idea of the hero. But similarly, again, we don't need to simply abandon them either and say that, well, since these are only effigies, right, only cultural conventions of heroism, and they vary based on cultural background and time period, that they have no value. There's nothing true in them at all, and we can simply disregard them, right? It's an arbitrary term, this term hero. If that's the case, then we simply cannot have a discussion. There has to be something upon which we can base our discussion so that when we're talking about heroism and the hero, we're not speaking at cross purposes, that we have some kind of form to hold on to. And that's why at the beginning I talked about not only what culture means and where it comes from and what we mean when we talk about culture and reading culture, but also the word hero itself. We looked at all these various meanings, and I said I'm not going to necessarily say this is the one definition that we all have to use, but we do have to have some shared conception of the word in order to speak about it together. And that's where the end of the allegory, this idea of the sun being some kind of allegory for goodness, or we could even possibly say truth, could be useful, right? Right, because what does the sun do? It illuminates things so that we can see, ideally, so that we can all see the same thing, so we can all talk about the same thing. So in the context of reading culture and in the context of our discussion of heroism and the hero, it's possible that we could see that image, that allegory of the sun, as a kind of type or a form of the hero, a type of the hero that transcends an individual work of literature. And possibly it could be argued even transcends culture, so that even though we're going to be looking at a myriad and a variety of different kinds of text, poetry, drama, fiction, nonfiction, again, works that are very, very recent and from the deep oral past, works from cultures that are not particularly close to our own, and ones which are very much similar to our own Western culture. And the one thing that could bind these all together is this type of the hero. Now, possibly at the end of this journey, you may decide that there really isn't anything holding it together, right? That it is all just kind of arbitrary. But you may possibly come to a different conclusion, that even though we are seeing it used in all various kinds of ways, in different contexts, right? Some of these heroes may be very much in fitting with our contemporary use of the notion, and others may be very, very different from it. That nevertheless, all of these can be brought together in such a way that even if they don't lock into a completely solid pattern, that at least there are enough similarities of pattern in the stories, we can ultimately bring it together and actually have a discussion about here's how the concept of the hero has changed in culture. Because even though it does certainly change and varies from culture to culture, for something to change, there has to be a solid thing that itself can morph. In other words, if the idea of the hero has no more solidity than the shadows on the wall, then it's as different and as varied as there are different manifestations, different characters, different plot actions. But if we can talk about such a thing as the tragic hero, it assumes that there's something common to the heroes of tragedy. If we can talk about the medieval hero, right, means there's something common to the concept of the hero in medieval texts. If we can talk about something like the feminine hero, right, it assumes that there's something common to the portrayals of these heroines in these stories. And these are all ideas, right, that exist outside of just the plot elements. So point of beginning with Plato is simply to hopefully kind of point towards the direction of our discussions in the coming weeks. Discussions, hopefully, not based in plot summary or plot description, but in higher ideas about what heroism means and what the hero means in literature. In other words, it's a signpost, you could say, to ascend from the Shadowlands into the light of what could perhaps be called literary inquiry, and hopefully will be a useful signpost for all future discussions in reading culture.